I just shot somebody on my front porch with a shotgun banging on my door.
On a cold, rainy November night in Michigan, the kind of night where even the street lamps seem hesitant to shine, 19-year-old Renisha McBride lost control of her car. The crash was sudden, jarring metal against metal, and she stumbled out of the wreckage, dazed and injured. Her hand was bleeding. Her mind was foggy. Unknown to her at the time, she was suffering from a concussion, her thoughts confused, her motor skills impaired. All she knew in that moment was one thing. She needed help. The streets of Dearborn Heights were quiet that night. Houses stood like silent guardians under the weight of rain, lights out, doors locked. Renisha made her way through the shadows toward a house that looked like any other. Ordinary, safe. She knocked. Then she banged. Maybe she cried out. The details of what happened on that porch in the early morning hours of November the 2nd, 2013 will never be fully known. But what is certain is this. Renisha McBride never walked away. Inside the house, 54-year-old Theodore Wafer was asleep until the noise startled him awake. What he did next would forever alter both of their lives. He reached for his shotgun. Minutes later, he pulled open the front door. What happened in the seconds that followed has been the subject of national debate, legal scrutiny, and heartbreaking reflection. Did Theodore believe he was in danger? Was it a tragic mistake fueled by fear? Or was it something else? Something far more deliberate? What we do know is this. Renisha McBride was shot in the face with a 12-gauge Mossberg shotgun.
Homeowner says there was somebody pounding on the door. He opened the door, like to say who the heck's out here, and his gun discharged and shot this black female in the head.
She died instantly on Theodore Wafer's front porch. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a collision of circumstances, race, fear, misunderstanding, and the flawed boundaries of self-defense laws. And it all began with a knock on the door. Now, over a decade later, we retrace every step, every 911 call, every hesitation, every lie. This is the story of Renisha McBride, of Theodore Wafer, and of the fatal moment where two strangers met under the worst possible conditions. It was 4:42 a.m. when the call came in. On the recording, Theodore Wafer's voice is tight, dry, almost detached. "I just shot somebody on my front porch, with a shotgun," he says. The weight of those words seems to hang in the air, even through the static of the emergency line. Wafer doesn't sound panicked. He doesn't cry. He doesn't plead for help. He simply reports what happened, like someone describing a broken pipe or a strange noise in the night. But behind that monotone voice lies something far more sinister. Within minutes, officers from the Dearborn Heights Police Department arrived at the house. A black female lay on the porch, unresponsive. The damage to her face was catastrophic. She had been shot at such close range that her jaw and much of her skull were pulverized. There was no chance of survival. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Police immediately separated Wafer from the body and placed him in the back of a cruiser. Still, there was no clear picture of what had occurred. According to him, there had been persistent banging on his doors and windows. It had gone on for some time, long enough to rattle him. "Who is this?" he claimed to have said as he opened the door. The shotgun, he explained, simply discharged. But even as he sat in the patrol car, shock beginning to settle in, officers noted inconsistencies in his story. There was confusion. Was the gun loaded or not? Had he intended to fire or not? Why had he opened the door in the first place if he felt genuinely threatened? Wafer claimed he didn't even realize the gun was ready to fire. But to investigators, that didn't make sense. There are conscious steps involved in preparing a shotgun to shoot. You don't just pick it up and bump into a fatal misfire. It requires loading, chambering, and disengaging the safety. Still, in those early hours, no one made any accusations. The scene was being processed. Theories floated quietly among investigators. Was this self-defense or something darker? As the sun began to rise over Michigan, the identity of the victim became known. Her name was Renisha McBride. She was 19 years old. Her car had been found a few blocks away, damaged, abandoned, the airbag deployed. And now, just hours later, Her body was lying cold and lifeless on the concrete of a stranger's porch. And somewhere in the haze of that early morning, one question began to take shape. A question that would haunt detectives, prosecutors, and an entire nation. Did Renisha McBride die because she was black, drunk, and desperate for help? Or did she die simply because she knocked on the wrong door? Rain still drizzled lightly as flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness. The police secured the scene with yellow tape, now fluttering in the cold morning wind. Theodore Wafer sat in the back of a squad car, silent, his eyes wide and unblinking. His shotgun had already been taken from him. It rested inside a clear evidence bag, still loaded, still warm. On the porch, Renisha's body lay sprawled and broken. Officers took photographs, marked blood spatter, and traced the bullet's trajectory. Every inch of the scene was measured, captured, and documented. The entryway, the door frame, the wood grain soaked with rain, and something much darker. It wasn't just a shooting. It was an execution in the eyes of some. The blast was close range, her injuries catastrophic. Wafer's own demeanor was puzzling. He wasn't belligerent, but neither was he particularly emotional. At one point, he muttered quietly, "Oh my God. Oh my God." But it was hard to tell whether it was shock, guilt, or simply confusion. His mind appeared stuck in a loop, repeating that he hadn't meant to shoot, hadn't even known the gun was loaded. Meanwhile, paramedics pronounced Renisha dead. No CPR, no last-ditch effort. Her injuries left no room for doubt. It was instant, unrecoverable. The shot had destroyed the very part of her that could have screamed for help or told her side of the story. Back inside the house, police began piecing together the moments before the shooting. The door had no signs of forced entry. No windows broken, no shattered glass or kicked-in panels. The only marks were faint smudges, handprints possibly, on the door frame. There were no weapons found on Renisha. She carried no bag, no tools, nothing but the clothes on her back and the injuries from the car crash she'd walked away from just hours earlier. Investigators questioned neighbors. Had anyone heard yelling, screaming, a struggle? But most people had been asleep. It was 4:30 a.m. on a weekend morning. One neighbor did report hearing loud bangs, not just the gunshot, but pounding on doors, maybe crying. It sounded like someone was desperate, they said, like they needed help. At this point, there was no narrative that tied all the evidence together. Just one undeniable fact. A young woman had come to a stranger's door in the middle of the night and ended up dead. For detectives, this case wasn't just about ballistics. It was about intent. Why had Theodore opened that door with a shotgun in hand? And what was really going through his mind when he pulled the trigger? The answers wouldn't come easily. But the first step was clear. Wafer had to be taken in. It was time for an official interview. The interview room was stark and cold. Just 4 pale walls, a steel table, and a single camera rolling silently in the corner. Theodore Wafer sat hunched in his chair, arms crossed tightly across his chest. His breathing was shallow, uneven. Detectives entered calmly, offering him water, asking if he understood his rights. He nodded, hesitant. Then came the inevitable question. "Why don't you walk us through what happened tonight, in your own words?" Wafer seemed disoriented. I don't really know how this works," he stammered. "Should I have a lawyer present?" It was a vague, half-hearted attempt to invoke his Miranda rights, and the detective, recognizing the ambiguity, gently pushed forward. "That's entirely up to you," he replied. "But this is serious. A young woman is dead. We need to know the truth." Theodore leaned forward, hands clasped nervously. "I just heard this banging, really loud. It startled me. I got scared. It was dark, raining, and someone was hammering on the side of the house, then the windows, then the front door." He said the knocking had gone on for minutes. He described a sense of panic creeping in, claiming it felt like someone was trying to break in. "I grabbed my shotgun. I didn't know if it was loaded or not, but I went to the door. I was yelling, 'Who is this?' But no one answered. Just more banging." The detective listened closely, then asked, "So, what did you do next?" "I opened the door," Wafer said, "with one hand, and I had the gun in the other. I didn't even realize I had my finger near the trigger. It went off." His voice cracked slightly then. It could have been guilt or fear. Either way, the room filled with a heavy silence. But even in those early statements, inconsistencies began to emerge. He wasn't sure if the gun was loaded, yet he'd kept the shells in a separate closet. He said he didn't mean to shoot, but claimed the banging was so aggressive that he feared for his life. He said he was scared, but he chose to open the door. The detective probed further. "Did you see who it was before you fired?" Wafer shook his head. "No, I just opened it and boom." "Was the door fully open?" "I think so, maybe halfway, I don't know, I just reacted." To the investigators, that explanation didn't sit right. This wasn't a case where someone broke into the home and was met with force. This was a case where someone knocked, and the homeowner opened the door, gun in hand, and pulled the trigger. The detectives took notes quietly. Wafer's story would need more scrutiny. But one thing was already becoming clear. This wasn't just a frightened man making a mistake. This was a potential homicide cloaked in panic and poor decisions. And they were just getting started. As the interview progressed, the veneer of Theodore Wafer's story began to wear thin. His hands fidgeted in his lap. His answers became more fragmented. The calm, slightly robotic tone he had started with gave way to moments of uncertainty, even paranoia. But when it came to describing the shotgun, his voice steadied again. "It's a Mossberg," he said. "Pistol grip. I keep it behind a door. I don't usually load it unless I feel like I need to." That raised a flag for investigators. Wafer had said earlier he didn't think the gun was loaded. Now, he was admitting he may have loaded it weeks before, after being paintballed by local kids. His paranoia, it seemed, wasn't new. It had been building for some time. "So you kept a shell in the chamber, just in case?" the detective asked. "I might have. I really can't remember," Wafer said. "I didn't even think about it when I grabbed it." Detectives weren't convinced. Loading a shell, racking it into place, these are deliberate actions, not easily forgotten. The narrative of the accidental discharge was starting to unravel, and so was the emotional foundation of Theodore's defense. "I didn't mean to shoot anyone," he repeated. "I just wanted whoever it was to stop banging." But why open the door if he truly believed he was under threat? Why not call 911 first? Why not wait it out like most people do when they're unsure who's outside? The questions piled up. But Wafer stuck to his core story, that the noise was intense, relentless, and terrifying. "It was coming from every direction," he said. "First the side window, then the back of the house. I thought, maybe more than one person. I don't know." The detective then pivoted to gun positioning. "Where was the shotgun when it fired?" Wafer hesitated. "I think waist height. I wasn't aiming." But this, too, didn't make sense. Renisha McBride was shorter than Wafer, around 5'4". For the shot to have struck her in the face as it did, the muzzle had to be nearly level with her head. That meant Wafer would have had to raise the weapon, aim intentionally, and pull the trigger. Saying it went off at waist height simply didn't match the forensic reality. In law enforcement, this is what's known as distancing language, when a suspect tries to minimize their role by shifting blame to the weapon or the circumstance. "It went off" is a lot easier to say than "I shot her." It creates psychological space between the person and their actions. But in Wafer's case, the story was collapsing under its own contradictions, and now detectives had what they needed. Doubt. Not about whether he fired the shot, but about whether it was truly accidental, or a calculated overreaction to a perceived threat that never existed. The next step was clear. They would test every detail of Wafer's account against the evidence, and they'd let the facts, not just his fear, speak for themselves. The science didn't lie. While Theodore Wafer tried to cling to the idea that his shotgun had just gone off, forensic evidence began to paint a very different story, one that removed ambiguity, one that demanded accountability. First, the physical evidence on Renisha McBride's body. The wound from the 12-gauge shotgun shell was not random or glancing. It had entered her face with extreme force, directly above the jawline. The type of wound indicated a close-range shot, and the angle? Dead straight. Not from the hip, not by accident. It was a shot aligned with purpose. Forensic analysts determined that for Wafer to have hit her where he did, he would have needed to hold the gun at shoulder or chest height, aimed squarely at her head. That alone shattered his account. Then there was the question of the door. Wafer had claimed he opened it partway, maybe halfway. but the presence of stippling and gunpowder residue suggested that the shot was fired through an open door, not through glass or wood. And crucially, there were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no kicked-in panels. Just one person knocking. The crime scene technicians also recovered only one spent shell casing. Wafer had told police he thought the gun was unloaded, but having a single round chambered and no others nearby suggested something far more premeditated. It didn't feel like a man protecting his home. It felt like someone waiting for an excuse to pull the trigger. Even Wafer's home setup cast doubt on his fear narrative. There were windows he could have looked through before opening the door. There was a peephole, and yet he chose to open the door, shotgun in hand, without knowing who stood on the other side. It wasn't just detectives saying this. Firearms experts were brought in to verify the claims. The mechanics of Wafer's shotgun were tested again and again. It couldn't have fired by itself. It required at least 2 steps: the racking of a shell into the chamber and a deliberate pull of the trigger. Both actions had to be made with force. Neither could occur by accident or light touch. The trajectory analysis, too, confirmed the angle of the shot was consistent with someone standing, aiming, and firing with intent. Renisha's own posture, likely leaning forward slightly, injured and confused, made her an easy target for someone standing inside, leveling the weapon outward. To add to the chilling picture, there were no defensive wounds, no struggle, no scream, just a bang in the rain, and then silence. In that moment, the forensic puzzle pieces clicked into place. Whatever fear Wafer had claimed, the science showed something else: control, intention, a fatal decision that could no longer hide behind uncertainty. From here, investigators didn't just see a tragic mistake. They saw a story manipulated to dodge responsibility, and the courtroom would soon have to decide, was this man a victim of his own panic, or had he become a killer the moment he pulled that trigger? Michigan has what's called the Castle Doctrine, a legal principle that gives homeowners the right to use deadly force against intruders under certain conditions. The idea is simple. Your home is your castle. If someone breaks in and you believe your life is in danger, you don't have to retreat. You can defend yourself, even with lethal force. But as investigators dug deeper into the case, one thing became alarmingly clear. Theodore Wafer's situation didn't match the protections granted by the law he might have hoped to rely on. According to Wafer, he heard persistent banging. It frightened him. He believed someone might be trying to break into his house, and when he couldn't take it anymore, he opened the door to confront the unknown. But that last part, that decision to open the door, is precisely where his Castle Doctrine defense began to fall apart. Under Michigan law, deadly force is only justified if the person reasonably believes it's necessary to prevent great bodily harm, sexual assault, or death. And crucially, the threat has to be immediate. In Wafer's case, the threat wasn't inside his home. It was on the porch, and he brought it inside by opening the door himself, shotgun in hand. Even by his own account, Renisha McBride never tried to force her way inside. There were no broken windows, no kicked doors, no threats screamed through the dark. Just a girl, possibly crying, definitely banging, but still outside. What's more, the legal doctrine doesn't protect homeowners who provoke or escalate a situation. If Wafer had simply stayed behind his locked door and called 911, as most people would, the situation may have resolved with nothing more than a noise complaint. But by opening that door, Wafer essentially stepped out of the protective shadow of Castle Doctrine and into murky legal terrain. He chose confrontation over caution. And then there was another layer, the racial element. Renisha McBride was a young black woman in a predominantly white neighborhood. To her family and many civil rights advocates, this wasn't just a shooting. It was a tragedy fueled by racial profiling, unconscious bias, and fear of the other. Would a white teenager knocking for help have met the same end? The prosecution would later argue that Wafer's fear was not grounded in logic or immediate threat, but in assumptions. That he looked through the peephole, saw a young black woman on his porch at 4:30 in the morning, and made a fatal decision based more on prejudice than danger. Fear is subjective, but law isn't. And when fear becomes the justification for a killing, the law requires that fear to be reasonable. In this case, the evidence suggested otherwise. Wafer didn't shoot to stop a break-in. He didn't shoot to protect someone else. He shot because he didn't wait long enough to find out what Renisha McBride really needed. And in doing so, he forfeited the legal shield he thought might protect him. To understand how Renisha McBride ended up at Theodore Wafer's doorstep, we have to go back several hours into the murky, disjointed timeline that unfolded after midnight on November 2nd, 2013. It began with a crash. Just before 1 a.m., a 911 call reported a car accident in Detroit. A woman, described as dazed but not physically injured, had slammed her Ford Taurus into a parked car at high speed. Witnesses later said she seemed confused, glassy-eyed, possibly intoxicated. When they tried to approach her, she didn't respond clearly. Then, before police could arrive, she walked away into the darkness. That woman was Renisha McBride. She left her phone in the car. She was injured, and she was alone. At some point in those early hours, she returned to the crash site, possibly looking for help or trying to retrieve something. But by the time police and EMS reached the scene, she had vanished again. From there, the record goes silent. There's a 3.5-hour gap between the initial crash at around 1 a.m. and the moment Theodore Wafer pulled the trigger at 4:42 a.m. No security footage ever surfaced to trace Renisha's route. No clear sightings placed her anywhere between those two tragic moments. It's as if she simply drifted through the night, injured and disoriented, looking for someone, anyone, to help. Toxicology reports would later confirm she had alcohol and marijuana in her system. Her blood alcohol content was more than twice the legal limit for driving. Combined with her head injury from the crash, Renisha was in a severely impaired state. It likely explained her erratic behavior, her decision to knock on Wafer's door so persistently, and her inability to respond clearly. But impairment is not justification for death. Had someone stopped her? Had the first responders reached her just minutes earlier? This story could have ended in a hospital, not a morgue. Her family believes she was simply seeking help, that even in her confusion, she knew she needed someone. Yet others pointed fingers at Renisha herself. Critics noted that she was drunk, that she'd made poor decisions that night, that she bore some responsibility for putting herself in harm's way. But that line of thinking ignored the central truth. She didn't break into anyone's house. She didn't carry a weapon. She knocked on a door. And the person on the other side didn't ask if she was okay, didn't wait for police, didn't try to understand. He opened the door and ended her life. What happened between the crash and the shooting remains a void, a chilling stretch of time lost to the shadows of that November night. But what's clear is that Renisha McBride's final hours were filled with confusion, injury, and a desperate, tragic search for safety that ended in the most violent way imaginable. The trial of Theodore Wafer began in the summer of 2014 and quickly drew national attention. The courtroom became a crucible, not just for the facts of the case, but for the deeper questions simmering beneath the surface: fear, race, justice, and the limits of self-defense. From the very first day, prosecutors were adamant this was not a mistake. This was a decision. They painted Wafer as a man who reacted not to a real threat, but to paranoia. They highlighted how he had options. He could have called 911, stayed behind locked doors, or shouted a warning. But instead, he opened his front door and fired a 12-gauge shotgun into the face of an unarmed teenager. The prosecution's case hinged on intent. They emphasized the forensic evidence, the direct angle of the shot, the lack of forced entry, the absence of any sign that Renisha was trying to break in. They brought in firearm experts, pathologists, and even crime scene reconstructionists to show that the shot was not accidental. It was aimed and deliberate. The defense, in contrast, tried to frame Wafer as a man caught in a terrifying situation, a man who had been startled awake in the dead of night by aggressive pounding. They argued he feared for his life, that he thought someone, or multiple people, were trying to invade his home. They tried to use Michigan's Castle Doctrine to justify his actions. But it wasn't enough. Wafer's own recorded interviews came back to haunt him. His shifting statements about the shotgun, loaded or not, aimed or not, made him seem unreliable. The prosecution argued that his story evolved to suit the pressure he was under, rather than reflect the truth. And then came the emotional heart of the trial: Renisha's family. They spoke of a young woman who was loving, funny, and full of promise. A teenager who made a bad decision that night. but one who never deserved to die for it. Her mother's testimony in particular brought tears to the courtroom, reminding jurors that this case wasn't just about technicalities. It was about a life lost. After 9 days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. On September 3, 2014, Theodore Wafer was found guilty on all counts: second-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, and felony firearm possession. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Wafer showed little visible reaction, just a slow nod, perhaps finally understanding the weight of what had happened. A month later, he was sentenced to 15 to 30 years for second-degree murder, 7 to 15 years for manslaughter, and 2 years for the firearm charge. Though the sentences would run concurrently, the message was clear. The justice system held him accountable. But even in the aftermath, debate continued. Some saw the sentencing as fair, a clear message that fear does not excuse deadly force. Others believed Wafer was overpunished, that his fear, however misplaced, was real. Regardless of perspective, the verdict was final. The door had been opened, the shot had been fired, and a young woman's life had been cut short. Now the law had spoken. Just when it seemed like the case had finally been closed, Theodore Wafer reemerged, this time not through new evidence, but through a legal technicality that forced the state to look again. In 2015, Wafer's legal team filed an appeal, arguing that his convictions for both second-degree murder and manslaughter were legally inconsistent. Under Michigan law, murder in the second degree implies intent and malice. Manslaughter, on the other hand, typically refers to a killing that happens in the heat of the moment, without that same level of premeditation. The defense argued that a person cannot, legally speaking, both intentionally and unintentionally kill someone in the same act. To the surprise of many, the Michigan Supreme Court agreed. In 2018, the court vacated Wafer's manslaughter conviction, stating that it conflicted with the second-degree murder charge. They affirmed the murder conviction, but agreed that charging both was constitutionally problematic. The court didn't throw out the case. It didn't even lessen Wafer's punishment at the time, but it cracked open a door to a possible new sentence. For Wafer, it was a small opening, and by June 2022, nearly a decade after Renisha McBride's death, he was brought back before a judge for resentencing. It was a different courtroom, a different year, and a changed world, but the judge remained firm. While the manslaughter charge was off the table, the murder conviction still stood, and for that, Wafer would still face 15 to 30 years behind bars. The prosecution reiterated that Wafer had opened his door and fired a shotgun at close range into the face of a confused teenager, that he had not acted in a split-second panic but had made a conscious and ultimately unjustifiable choice. Wafer's attorney countered with a more somber tone. He argued that the now 64-year-old man had effectively been given a slow death sentence, that by the time Wafer became eligible for parole, he'd be in his 70s. He asked the court to consider the human cost of incarceration for a man who, in his view, had acted out of fear, not malice. But the court didn't waver. At his resentencing, Wafer's term remained unchanged. The manslaughter conviction was erased from his record, but the consequences of his actions remained fully intact. He would not walk free. Renisha's family, once again in court, expressed a grim satisfaction. They knew this wouldn't bring her back, but they believed that justice, though delayed and challenged, had been served. Today, Theodore Wafer continues to serve his sentence in a Michigan prison. His story now sits in the annals of true crime, marked by tragedy, fear, and irreversible decisions. Renisha McBride is remembered not as a symbol or a headline, but as a young woman who deserved help, not harm. Her death sparked national conversations about race, fear, and the dangers of assuming the worst. And in her name, many have vowed to make sure that no knock for help is ever mistaken for a threat again.